In 1791, the United States federal government imposed the first tax on domestically produced spirits. Farmers in western Pennsylvania who had been converting their surplus corn into whiskey for generations refused to pay. What followed was called the Whiskey Rebellion, and President George Washington sent 13,000 federal troops to crush it. The tax was repealed 10 years later, but the principle had been established. The government owned the right to tax what you made with your own hands on your own land. Your great-grandfather did not accept that principle. He moved deeper into the Appalachian Mountains and kept distilling by moonlight. Number 8 on this list was used by every moonshiner in 3 states and is now a federal offense, carrying up to 5 years in prison. Number 16 was a survival technique that predated the United States itself, and modern zoning law now classifies it as an illegal structure. These 25 tricks were not criminal because they were dangerous. They were criminal because they threatened somebody's tax revenue. Before we start, hit subscribe. What you are about to hear is not a recipe for breaking the law. It is a record of how American families in the most isolated mountains on the eastern seaboard survived for 200 years using ingenuity that the government could never fully stamp out. Let us count down the 25 moonshiner survival tricks. Number 25. Converting corn into currency. A bushel of corn in 1820 was worth about 25 cents at market. That same bushel, distilled into 2.5 gallons of whiskey, was worth $1.25. On rutted mountain roads, where a wagon might not survive the journey to town, corn was too heavy and too cheap to haul. Whiskey was light, concentrated, and universally accepted as payment. Your great-grandfather paid debts in whiskey. He paid the doctor in whiskey. He traded it for salt, flour, nails, and cloth. Whiskey was the economy of the mountains before paper money reached them. The government did not outlaw distilling because it was dangerous. It outlawed untaxed distilling because it wanted its cut of the only cash crop the mountains could produce. Number 24. Building a copper pot still from scrap. A moonshiner's still was not a factory product. It was hand-built from hammered copper sheeting, brazed joints, and a coiled copper tube called a worm, which served as the condenser. The pot held the fermented mash. Heat turned the alcohol into vapor. The vapor traveled through the worm, which was submerged in cold running water and condensed back into liquid. A competent mountain craftsman could build a working still from salvaged copper in a weekend. When revenue agents found a still and chopped it apart with axes, another one appeared within weeks, built from the same salvaged metal. The knowledge of copper working, brazing, and thermal dynamics required to build a functional still was passed from father to son for generations. Today, owning a still without a federal permit is legal in most states, but operating one to produce alcohol without a distiller's license is a federal felony. Number 23. Reading the bead to test alcohol proof. Your grandfather did not have a hydrometer. He shook the jar and watched the bubbles. In the moonshine trade, this was called reading the bead. When high-proof spirit is shaken, it produces a ring of small, persistent bubbles on the surface. The size, duration, and pattern of those bubbles indicate the proof. Large bubbles that disappear quickly mean low proof. Small, tight bubbles that hold in a ring mean high proof, typically above 100. An experienced moonshiner could estimate proof within 5 points by sight alone. This was not a party trick. It was quality control. A run that came in too low was rerun through the still. A run that came in too hot was cut with water from the spring. The technique requires no equipment and no electricity. It requires years of observation and a teacher who knew what to look for. Number 22. Hiding a still site by reading the landscape. A still needed 3 things: a water source, firewood, and concealment. The best locations were deep hollows with a spring or creek, heavy tree cover, and only one path in. Your grandfather chose sites where smoke from the fire would disperse through the tree canopy before rising above the ridge. He positioned the still near running water so the sound of the creek masked the operation. He built on a slope so gravity fed the water through the worm without a pump. Every element of the site was chosen to work with the land rather than against it. Revenue agents learned to look for paths that were too well worn, for smoke that did not match the season, and for the faint, sweet smell of fermenting corn mash that carried downwind. The moonshiner learned to counter every one of those tells. Number 21, using the foreshots and the feints. The first liquid that comes off a still run is called the foreshots. It contains methanol, acetone, and other volatile compounds that can cause blindness or death. Every experienced moonshiner knew to discard the first cup. The last portion of the run, called the feints or the tails, contains fusel oils that taste harsh and cause brutal hangovers. An experienced distiller cut the run at precisely the right moment, keeping only the hearts, the clean middle portion. The knowledge of where to make those cuts was the difference between safe whiskey and poison. It was passed down through families with the seriousness of a medical education. The reputation that moonshine causes blindness comes almost entirely from inexperienced or careless operators who failed to discard the foreshots. Your grandfather knew the smell, the taste, and the temperature at which the cut had to be made. He knew it because his father taught him, and his father was taught by his. Number 20, running at night by the light of the moon. The word moonshine comes from the practice itself. Your grandfather ran his still after dark because fire produces visible smoke, detectable smoke during the day, and revenue agents watched the ridge lines. At night, smoke dispersed into darkness. The glow of the fire was shielded by the hollow in the tree cover. He worked by moonlight and by the light of the fire itself. He knew his way through the woods in the dark because he had walked those paths since childhood. He could run an entire batch, jar it, and cache it before dawn. The agents worked during the day. He worked at night. This was not romance. It was operational security, practiced by subsistence farmers who could not afford to lose their still or their freedom. Number 19, making whiskey from anything that would ferment. Corn was the preferred grain, but your grandfather was not limited to corn. He fermented rye, barley, wheat, apples, peaches, plums, persimmons, honey, molasses, and sugar. During the Depression, when grain was scarce, some moonshiners fermented sugar and water with a little cornmeal added for flavor. Apple brandy, called Applejack, was a staple of mountain life. Peach brandy was a luxury product that commanded premium prices. The skill was not in following a recipe. The skill was in understanding fermentation itself, how yeast converts sugar into alcohol, how temperature affects the process, how to tell by smell and taste when the mash was ready to run. That understanding is the foundation of every brewery, winery, and distillery operating legally today. Your grandfather had it without a textbook. First pattern. Break. Here's the thing about moonshining that nobody says in polite company. It was not a crime of greed. It was a crime of geography. A farmer in the Appalachian Mountains in 1850 had corn, water, fire, and copper. He did not have roads that could carry his corn to market before it spoiled. He did not have access to banks that would lend him money. He did not have a cash economy within 30 miles. The only way to convert his crop into something portable, durable, and valuable was to distill it. The government called this a crime. The farmer called it the only rational economic decision available to a man surrounded by mountains and corn. Both were right. Neither was wrong. Number 17, caching whiskey in the woods. Your grandfather did not store his product at home. He cached it. He buried jars in creek banks where the cold water kept them cool, and the running water masked the smell. He hid them in hollow logs, in stone walls, and in root cellars dug into hillsides that were separate from the house. He cached in multiple locations so that if one was discovered, the rest survived. This was inventory management practiced by a man who could not insure his product, could not call the police if it was stolen, and could not explain its existence if asked. The skill was in choosing locations that were accessible to him and invisible to everyone else. Many caches were never retrieved. To this day, hikers in Appalachian forests occasionally find mason jars buried in creek banks with the lids still sealed. The best still sites were not built structures. They were natural rock overhangs, shallow caves, and cliff faces that provided shelter without requiring construction that could be spotted from the air or along the trail. Your grandfather built his fire against a rock wall that absorbed and radiated heat. He positioned the still under a ledge so the smoke dispersed laterally into the tree line. When revenue agents searched, they looked for buildings. They did not always think to search the rock formations. Modern zoning law in most counties now requires permits for any structure, including lean-tos and shelters built on public or private land. The natural rock still house violated no building code because no building code existed when your grandfather built it. The laws caught up later. The rock formations did not change. Number 15. Using corn mash as animal feed after distillation. After the alcohol was removed from a batch of corn mash, the leftover grain, called spent mash or slop, was still rich in protein and fiber. Your grandfather fed it to his hogs and cattle, and the animals thrived on it. The practice served two purposes. It eliminated the evidence of distilling, and it fed the livestock for free. A moonshiner whose hogs were fat and healthy in winter was a moonshiner who was running his still regularly. Revenue agents knew this. They watched the condition of a family's livestock for signs of distilling activity. Your grandfather knew they watched, so he kept his neighbor's hogs fed too, to avoid a pattern that would single out his farm. Number 14, modifying a car to outrun the law. When moonshine had to move from the mountains to the cities, it moved by car. Your grandfather, or the runner he hired, drove a vehicle that looked stock on the outside and was anything but stock underneath. Runners installed heavy-duty springs and shocks to carry the weight of a full load without the car sagging visibly. They bored out engines, added extra carburetors, and modified transmissions for higher top speeds on winding mountain roads. They practiced bootleg turns, a technique of spinning the car 180 degrees at full speed using the handbrake. These modified cars and the men who drove them became the direct origin of NASCAR. The National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing was founded in 1948 by drivers who had learned their craft running moonshine through the mountains of North Carolina and Georgia. Stock car racing is the modification of an ordinary car for extraordinary performance. That is exactly what your grandfather's whiskey runner did every Friday night. Number 13. Using a lookout system to warn revenue agents. No moonshiner worked alone. Every operation had a network of lookouts, usually family members or trusted neighbors, positioned along the roads and trails leading to the still site. A child on a hilltop with a mirror could signal a warning by reflected sunlight. A woman hanging a specific color of laundry on the line told the hollow that agents had been spotted on the road. A single rifle shot in the distance meant shut down and scatter. The communication system was analog, untraceable, and instantaneous within its range. Revenue agents knew these systems existed but could not crack them because they were based on family trust rather than technology. Second pattern break. Here is what the revenue agents never understood about the mountains. The moonshiner was not a lone criminal. He was a node in a community that depended on him. The corn he bought kept his neighbor's farm solvent. The whiskey he produced was the currency that paid the blacksmith, the doctor, and the general store. The runner who carried it to the city brought back cash that circulated through the hollow for months. When the government destroyed a still, it did not stop a crime. It collapsed a local economy. The communities that protected their moonshiners were not protecting a criminal. They were protecting the only industry they had. Number 11. Producing medicinal alcohol during Prohibition. During Prohibition, the production and sale of alcohol was banned with one significant exception. Alcohol prescribed by a physician for medicinal purposes remained legal. Pharmacies dispensed whiskey by prescription, and the prescriptions were written liberally. Your grandfather may have supplied the local pharmacist with product that arrived through unofficial channels and left through official ones. The distinction between illegal moonshine and legal medicinal alcohol was often nothing more than a piece of paper signed by a doctor who understood that his community needed what the law had decided it could not have. Number 10, using natural spring water for a clean product. The quality of the water determined the quality of the whiskey. Your grandfather did not use well water or creek water because they could carry minerals or contaminants that affected taste. He used spring water that emerged from limestone rock, naturally filtered and cold. The limestone filtered impurities and added calcium, which aided the fermentation process. This is the same reason that Kentucky bourbon is made with limestone spring water today. Commercial distillers did not discover this. They inherited it from moonshiners who had been selecting their water sources by taste and result for 200 years. Number 9, teaching the craft only by oral tradition. No moonshiner wrote down his recipe. The knowledge was transmitted verbally, from father to son, uncle to nephew, grandmother to granddaughter. Writing it down created evidence. A notebook found during a raid was a confession. The oral tradition also ensured quality control through personal apprenticeship. You did not learn to make whiskey from a book. You learned by standing next to someone who knew what they were doing, watching every step, smelling every stage, tasting every cut. The knowledge was embodied, not documented. When the last practitioner in a family line died without teaching a successor, the specific recipe and technique died with them. Every family's whiskey tasted different because every family's knowledge was unique. Number 8, home distillation itself. This is the central trick on this list, and the one that connects everything else. Home distillation of spirits for personal consumption is a federal felony in the United States. The penalty is up to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. The law exists to protect federal excise tax revenue. It has nothing to do with safety, health, or public welfare. You can brew beer at home. You can make wine at home. You can ferment cider, mead, kombucha, and sauerkraut at home. You cannot distill. The reason is that distillation concentrates alcohol, and concentrated alcohol is taxed at a higher rate. Your grandfather made whiskey from his own corn with his own hands, on his own land, for his own family. The government decided that was a crime. He decided it was his birthright. That disagreement has not been resolved in 230 years. Number 7, using charred oak for aging and flavor. Your grandfather did not always drink his whiskey white. When he had time and patience, he aged it in charred oak barrels or in jars with charred oak chips. The charring caramelizes the sugars in the wood and creates a layer of activated carbon that filters harsh compounds from the spirit. The result is smoother, darker, and more complex. This is the exact process used by every bourbon distillery in Kentucky. The technique was not invented in a corporate laboratory. It was developed by mountain distillers who noticed that whiskey stored in a charred barrel tasted better than whiskey stored in a clean one. They did not know the chemistry. They knew the result. Number 6, making apple brandy by freeze distillation. In winter, your grandfather set a barrel of hard cider outside in the freezing cold. Water freezes at a higher temperature than alcohol. He removed the ice that formed on top, concentrating the alcohol in the remaining liquid. This method is known as freeze distillation. The process, also called jacking, produced Applejack, a potent apple brandy that required no still, no fire, and no copper. Technically, it was distillation, and today it is illegal. It was also the simplest form of spirit production available to a colonial farmer, and it predates the United States by a century. The technique requires a barrel, a winter, and patience. Nothing else. Your grandfather rarely sold his whiskey for cash. Cash transactions created tax liability and left a paper trail. Instead, he bartered. A gallon of whiskey for a season's worth of blacksmithing, a jar for a sack of flour, 2 jars for a piglet. The barter economy of the mountains was built on whiskey as the medium of exchange. No receipts were generated, no taxes were owed, no records existed. The IRS could not tax a transaction it could not prove occurred. This was not tax evasion as a criminal strategy. It was the normal economy of communities that had never fully entered the cash economy to begin with. Number 4. Using whiskey as medicine. Your grandmother used whiskey as an antiseptic for wounds, a painkiller for toothaches, a treatment for chest colds when mixed with honey and lemon, a sleep aid for the elderly, and a numbing agent for teething babies. She rubbed it on sore muscles, gargled it for sore throats, and gave it in small doses for stomach cramps. Alcohol is a documented antiseptic, analgesic, and sedative. The medical applications of distilled spirits were so well established that the United States government itself exempted medicinal alcohol from prohibition. Your grandmother did not need the exemption. She kept a mason jar in the back of the pantry, and she knew exactly how much to give and when. Number 3. Fermenting everything the land produced. Your grandmother did not limit fermentation to corn. She fermented cabbage into sauerkraut that kept through winter without refrigeration. She fermented cucumbers into pickles. She fermented milk into buttermilk and clabber. She made vinegar from every fruit that fell from a tree. She kept sourdough starter alive on the kitchen counter for years. Fermentation was not a hobby. It was the primary method of food preservation for mountain families who had no electricity and no access to commercial canning until the mid-20th century. Every one of these fermented foods contains beneficial bacteria that support gut health, a fact that modern probiotics research has confirmed. Your grandmother produced probiotics on her kitchen counter for free, using techniques that her mother taught her. The supplement industry now charges $40 a bottle for what she made from cabbage and salt. Number 2, the community code of silence. No moonshiner survived alone. The entire community participated in a code of silence that protected distillers from prosecution. Neighbors did not report stills. Store owners did not ask where the money came from. Preachers did not inquire about the contents of the jars brought to church suppers. Children were taught from an early age that certain things were not discussed outside the family. This was not omerta, it was survival. When the federal government sent revenue agents into communities where the only cash economy was whiskey, the community understood that cooperation with the agents meant economic destruction for everyone. The code held for generations. It holds in some hollows still. Number 1, the right to make what the land provides. This is not a single trick. It is the principle that animated every item on this list. Your great-grandfather believed that a man who grew his own corn on his own land had the right to do whatever he pleased with it, including turning it into whiskey. He believed that the federal government's claim on a percentage of his labor was an overreach that no free citizen should accept. He believed that the skills he inherited from his father, the copper work, the fermentation knowledge, the understanding of fire and water and grain, belonged to his family and not to the state. He was, by every legal definition, a criminal. He was also the most self-reliant man in his county. He fed his family, heated his home, paid his debts, and preserved a craft tradition that stretches back through Scotland and Ireland to a time before the United States existed. The law says he was wrong. The mountains say otherwise. Here is your challenge. Learn one fermentation skill this month. Make sauerkraut. Start a sourdough. Brew a batch of hard cider if your state allows it. Tell me in the comments whether your family has a moonshine story, because in Appalachia, almost every family does. That knowledge did not die. It just went underground, which is exactly where your grandfather always kept it. It is time to bring it into the light.